When the oncologist handed me those fake test results I had carefully forged, showing stage 4 pancreatic cancer with 6 months to live, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: power. For the first time in my 42 years of existence, I was about to discover who in my family actually loved me, and who was just waiting for me to disappear. What I found out over the next 2 years would shock me more than any real diagnosis ever could. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is David Chen, and I used to be the kind of man who apologized for taking up space in his own house. Every morning, I would wake up at 5:30 to prepare breakfast for my wife Rebecca and our 15-year-old daughter Sophie, only to eat alone while they rushed out without so much as a thank you. I worked 60-hour weeks as a corporate contracts lawyer at Martinez Technology Group, where my wife served as chief marketing officer and heiress to the family empire. The irony wasn't lost on me that I spent my days negotiating deals for a company that belonged to people who treated me like an unwanted guest at their dinner table. Rebecca and I had been married for 16 years, but somewhere along the way, I had become invisible. She would walk past me in our Hillsdale mansion as if I were furniture, speaking to me only when she needed something signed or when there was a social function where appearances mattered. At those company parties, she would slip her arm through mine and smile that practiced smile. Playing the role of the devoted wife while I stood there like a well-dressed prop, the moment we stepped back through our front door, the mask would drop and I would return to being the man who existed to pay bills and solve problems. Sophie had inherited her mother's talent for making me feel small. At 15, she had perfected the art of rolling her eyes whenever I spoke, sighing dramatically when I offered to help with homework, and finding elaborate ways to avoid spending time with me. When I suggested family movie nights, she would suddenly remember urgent plans with friends. When I offered to drive her to school, she would claim she preferred walking, even in Portland's notorious rain. The few times I managed to engage her in conversation, she would respond with single syllables while texting, making it clear that my presence was an interruption to her real life. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening in March. I had been working on a major acquisition deal for weeks, staying late every night to ensure everything was perfect. When I finally closed the contract, saving the company over $3 million, I rushed home, excited to share the news. I found Rebecca in the kitchen, scrolling through her phone while eating takeout Thai food. Sophie was at the counter, picking at spring rolls while complaining about her chemistry teacher. I walked in with a smile, my chest puffed with pride for the first time in months. Rebecca glanced up briefly when I started explaining about the deal, but her eyes drifted back to her phone within seconds. Sophie didn't even acknowledge that I had spoken. I stood there for several minutes, my voice growing quieter as I realized neither of them was listening. Finally, Rebecca looked up with mild irritation and said, "David, we're trying to eat. Can whatever this is wait until later?" She said it the way you might speak to a child who was interrupting adult conversation. Something inside me snapped. Not into anger, but into a cold, crystalline clarity. I looked around our kitchen, with its granite countertops and stainless steel appliances, and realized I was standing in a house where I was merely a financial contributor. I paid the mortgage, the utilities, the private school tuition, the car payments, and the credit card bills that funded their comfortable lifestyle. In return, I received the privilege of being ignored, dismissed, and treated as if my thoughts, feelings, and accomplishments were inconsequential. That night, as I lay in our king-size bed listening to Rebecca breathe beside me, I started planning. Not a divorce, not a confrontation, not a dramatic gesture that would give them ammunition to paint me as the unreasonable one. I started planning. Something far more sophisticated. I was going to discover, once and for all, what my life was actually worth to the people who claimed to love me. The idea came to me gradually over the following weeks. I began researching terminal illnesses, studying symptoms and progression rates. I learned about pancreatic cancer, how it was often called the silent killer, because symptoms appeared so late. I discovered that the 5-year survival rate was less than 10%, and that most patients lived only months after diagnosis. It was perfect because it would explain rapid physical decline. It would create urgency, and it would force everyone around me to confront what my absence would actually mean. I spent 3 months preparing. I found a private lab technician who was struggling financially and convinced him to help me create realistic-looking test results. One researched oncologists in other cities and created a fictional treatment plan. I even started losing weight deliberately, claiming stress from work, while secretly following a strict diet and exercise regimen that would make me appear to be wasting away. By summer, I had lost 30 pounds and had developed the slightly gaunt look that would support my story. The most challenging part was learning to act sick. I practiced coughing fits in my car during lunch breaks. I studied how cancer patients moved and spoke, watching documentaries and reading survivor accounts. I learned to wince occasionally when I thought no one was looking, to pause mid-sentence as if gathering strength, and to decline foods I used to enjoy. I became a method actor preparing for the role of my life, literally, on a humid Thursday. In July, I came home and told my family I needed to speak with them. Rebecca was in her home office, video calling with clients in Singapore. Sophie was in the living room, sprawled across the couch with her laptop and phone, presumably doing homework but actually watching TikTok videos. I asked them to join me in the kitchen, and for once, something in my tone made them comply without argument. I sat them down at our breakfast table, the same table where I had eaten alone for years, and delivered the news with the perfect amount of tremor in my voice. I told them about the stomach pains I had been experiencing, the doctor visits I had supposedly been hiding, and finally, the devastating diagnosis. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4, metastasized to my liver. 6 months to live, maybe 9 if the chemotherapy worked better than expected. The reactions were exactly what I had expected, and somehow, that hurt more than I had prepared for. Rebecca's first response was to ask about my life insurance policy and whether my illness would affect my ability to work. Sophie immediately started crying, not for me, but about how this would ruin her junior year and what her friends would think. Neither of them hugged me. Neither of them asked what I needed or how they could help. They both seemed primarily concerned with how my dying would inconvenience their lives. Over the following days, I watched them adjust to the news with remarkable efficiency. Rebecca started making calls to financial advisors and researching widows' benefits. Sophie began telling her friends that her father was sick, milking the sympathy while maintaining careful distance from me, as if cancer might be contagious. They both encouraged me to continue working as long as possible for the sake of maintaining normalcy and income. As weeks turned into months, I maintained my performance flawlessly. I attended fake chemotherapy sessions at a medical building across town, returning home with the appropriate level of exhaustion. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I gradually became thinner and more frail-looking. I started using a walking stick occasionally, claiming neuropathy from the treatments. I even shaved my head in stages, simulating the hair loss that would come from chemotherapy. But something unexpected began happening during this elaborate deception. As I spent less time trying to please my family and more time observing them, I started to see myself clearly for the first time in years. I realized that I had been so busy being the perfect husband and father that I had forgotten who David Chen actually was underneath all that desperate pleasing. I began to remember interests and dreams I had abandoned, opinions I had stopped expressing, and parts of my personality I had suppressed to avoid conflict. The revelation that would change everything came 8 months into my fake illness, when I overheard a conversation that revealed the true depth of my family's indifference. But that discovery would lead me down a path I never could have anticipated, toward people who would show me what genuine care actually looked like, and ultimately, toward a choice that would determine not just my survival, but my chance at actually living. The conversation I overheard happened on a rainy October evening when I was supposed to be at my weekly support group meeting. I had actually been sitting in Powell's books for 2 hours, reading philosophy texts and drinking coffee like a normal person, something I hadn't done in years. When I returned home earlier than expected, I heard voices coming from the kitchen and instinctively paused in the hallway. Rebecca was on the phone with her sister Maria, speaking in that casual tone people use when they think they're alone. Sophie was apparently in the room too, because I could hear her occasional comments between the sounds of her opening and closing the refrigerator. Honestly, Maria, it's been a blessing in disguise, Rebecca was saying. David's been so much easier to deal with since the diagnosis. He doesn't bother me about family dinners or vacations anymore. He just goes to his treatments and stays out of my way. There was a pause while Maria responded. Then Rebecca laughed. No, I'm not being heartless. I'm being practical. He's got good insurance, and the life insurance policy will set us up beautifully. Sophie can go to any college she wants. My daughter's voice chimed in with the casual cruelty that only teenagers can achieve. Mom, when Dad dies, can we renovate his office into a proper guest room? Chelsea's mom has this amazing setup where friends can stay over, and we could totally do that. Rebecca's response was swift and approving. Now, that's a wonderful idea, sweetheart. We could knock out that wall and make it twice the size. Maybe add a little kitchenette. They continued discussing their post-David renovation plans with the enthusiasm most people reserve for vacation planning. Rebecca mentioned finally being able to redecorate the master bedroom in the colors she actually liked, and she wouldn't have to consider my preferences anymore. Sophie suggested they could get a smaller dining table since they'd only need 2 chairs. They talked about my death like it was a home improvement project. They were excited to begin, standing in that hallway, listening to my wife and daughter plan their life without me. I felt something I hadn't experienced before, complete emotional detachment from these people who shared my name and address. The hurt I expected didn't come. Instead, I felt a strange sense of liberation, as if someone had just told me I was free to stop pretending to care about people who had never cared about me. The next morning, I made a decision that would change everything. Instead of going to the office, I drove to the Pearl District and walked into the first real estate office I saw. Within 3 hours, I had put a deposit down on a small but elegant apartment with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Willamette River. It was the first major decision I'd made in years without considering Rebecca's opinion or Sophie's. Convenience. That afternoon, I did something even more radical. I went to Oregon Medical Center, not for a fake appointment, but because I had heard they had an excellent volunteer program. I figured if I was supposed to be dying, I might as well spend time around people who understood what life was actually worth. I signed up to read 2 children in the pediatric ward, claiming I had flexible hours due to my illness. It was there 3 days later that I met Emma Thompson. She was a pediatric nurse with auburn hair that caught the light when she moved, and a smile that seemed to reach her eyes in a way I had forgotten was possible. She was sitting with a 7-year-old boy named Tyler, her nephew, who was recovering from a severe asthma attack. The boy was restless and cranky, refusing to stay. In bed and giving the other nurses trouble, Emma was reading him a story about pirates with different voices for each character, making Tyler giggle despite his discomfort. She had this natural ease with children that spoke of genuine affection rather than obligation. When she noticed me standing in the doorway with my volunteer badge, she smiled and gestured for me to come in. Tyler, this is Mr. Chen. He's here to read stories too. Maybe he knows some good ones about dragons or spaceships. Leah Tyler examined me with the serious intensity that sick children often develop. Are you sick too? Guard. I had become so practiced at discussing my fictional cancer with adults who didn't really want details that I hadn't considered how to explain it to a child. Emma must have sensed my hesitation because she smoothly intervened. Mr. Chen is here to help other people feel better, just like me. Sometimes grown-ups need stories too.
Ow!
Over the following weeks, I found myself spending more and more time at the hospital. I would tell Rebecca I had extended treatment sessions or support group meetings, then spend hours reading to children or helping Emma organize activities for young patients. Tyler, who lived with Emma after his parents died in a hiking accident 2 years earlier, became particularly attached to me. Unlike Sophie, who had always made me feel like my presence was an interruption, Tyler seemed genuinely excited when I arrived. He would save drawings for me, ask my opinion on important matters like whether dinosaurs could beat robots in a fight, and curl up next to me during story time with complete trust. For the first time in years, I felt useful to another human. Being Emma and I began talking during quiet moments in the children's ward. She told me about taking custody of Tyler after her brother's death, about the challenges of suddenly becoming a single parent, while working full-time as a nurse. She spoke about her fears that she wasn't enough for Tyler, that he needed more stability than she could provide. I found myself sharing more than I intended about my own relationship with Sophie, though I carefully avoided mentioning the fake cancer. What struck me most about Emma was how she listened. When I spoke, she put down whatever she was holding and gave me her complete attention. She asked follow-up questions that showed she had actually heard what I said. When I mentioned feeling like I had lost touch with who I used to be, she nodded with understanding rather than changing the subject. Sometimes when we spend so much time taking care of other people, we forget to take care of the person we used to be, she said one afternoon while we were organizing art supplies in the activity room. It's like we become so good at being what everyone else needs that we forget what we need. Her words hit me with unexpected force. I realized that in my 16 years of marriage, Rebecca had never once asked me what I needed or wanted. Conversations were always about her schedule, her preferences, her problems. Sophie had never shown curiosity about my thoughts or feelings beyond what directly affected her. I had become so accustomed to this dynamic that I had stopped expecting anything different. Emma, on the other hand, remembered details from our conversations days later. She would ask how my treatment was going with genuine concern in her voice. She noticed when I seemed tired or stressed and would suggest we take breaks. She even started bringing me coffee the way I liked it, having paid attention when I mentioned my preferences during one of our chats. The contrast between Emma's natural kindness and my family's indifference became more apparent each day. When I mentioned to Rebecca that the hospital volunteer work was helping my mood, she responded with irritation, asking if I was sure I had energy for such activities when I should be focusing on getting better. When I told Sophie about the children, I was reading too. She rolled her eyes and said it sounded depressing, but Emma encouraged my involvement with the children. She told me that Tyler talked about me at home, calling me his friend Mr. Chen, and repeating stories I had read to him. She said my presence made a real difference to the children, many of whom rarely had male visitors. For the first time in years, someone was telling me that I mattered, that my presence improved rather than complicated their life. As autumn turned to winter, I found myself creating an elaborate double life. At home, I continued my performance as the dying husband and father, growing thinner and more frail-looking, attending fake medical appointments and discussing my fictional prognosis with appropriate gravity. But at the hospital, surrounded by Emma and Tyler and the children I read to, I felt more alive than I had in decades. The irony wasn't lost on me that I had to pretend to be dying to finally start living. In my fake illness, I had found more genuine human connection than I had experienced in years of supposedly healthy family life. Emma and Tyler had given me something I had been starving for without realizing it. The simple experience of being wanted and appreciated exactly as I am but maintaining both lives was becoming increasingly complicated, and I knew that eventually I would have to make a choice between the family that was waiting for me to die and the people who made me feel grateful to be alive. And my carefully constructed facade came during Thanksgiving dinner. I had been maintaining my dying man performance for 8 months by then. And Rebecca had invited her entire extended family to witness what everyone assumed would be my last holiday season. The Martinez clan descended upon our house like well-dressed vultures, speaking in hushed tones and offering condolences with the practiced sympathy of people who were secretly relieved it wasn't happening to them. Rebecca's mother, Carmen Martinez, pulled me aside in the kitchen while I was pretending to struggle with opening a bottle of wine. She placed her perfectly manicured hand on my shoulder and spoke in the overly gentle voice people use with terminal patients. "David Miho, I want you to know that Rebecca and Sophie will always be family to us. You don't need to worry about them after you're gone. We'll take good care of them." Something about the way she said it, with that slight emphasis on after. "You're gone," triggered a response I hadn't expected. Instead of nodding gratefully as I had planned, I found myself studying her face with new eyes. Carmen had never liked me, had never considered me good enough for her daughter. And now she was barely containing her satisfaction at my impending departure from their lives. "That's very kind of you, Carmen," I replied, letting a hint of steel creep into my voice. Though I have to wonder why it took my dying for the family to start planning Rebecca's future. She blinked in surprise, clearly not expecting any pushback from the meek, dying man she thought I had become. Before she could respond, I excused myself and walked outside to the garden, where I could breathe without feeling suffocated by the performance I was putting on. That's when I noticed Sophie through the sliding glass door, standing with her cousins around the kitchen island. She was holding court, dramatically describing my illness to relatives who hung on every word. But she wasn't talking about fear or sadness or missing me. She was describing the practical benefits of my situation. "The life insurance is really good," she was saying to her cousin Maria, who was 2 years older and someone Sophie had always tried to impress. "Mom says I'll definitely be able to go to Stanford now. We're going to completely redo the house. Dad's always been so boring about decorating, but now Mom can finally make it look modern." Maria nodded with the kind of envious approval that teenage girls trade like currency. "That's so cool. I mean, it's sad about your dad, but at least something good comes out of it." Sophie shrugged with practiced nonchalance. "Yeah, I guess. I mean, he's been pretty much checked out for years anyway. At least this way it's official." Standing there in my own garden, listening to my daughter discuss my death as a home improvement opportunity, I felt the last vestiges of guilt about my deception evaporate. These people weren't mourning my future loss. They were celebrating their future freedom from me. They had already moved on emotionally, treating me like a walking estate settlement. The following Monday, I made a decision that would have been unthinkable 8 months earlier. Instead of going to my fake chemotherapy appointment, I drove to Emma's neighborhood in the Hawthorne district and spent the afternoon walking around, observing how normal families actually lived. I watched parents pushing strollers while talking to their children, couples holding hands while window shopping, teenagers who seemed to genuinely enjoy spending time with their families. When Emma invited me for dinner that evening, claiming she wanted to cook for someone who appreciated good food, I accepted without the usual elaborate explanations I had been giving Rebecca about my whereabouts. I simply texted my wife that I would be late due to extended treatment, and for the first time in months, I didn't feel anxious about her response. Emma's small craftsman house in Hawthorne was everything my Hillsdale mansion wasn't, where my home felt like a cold showcase. Hers felt warm and lived in. Tyler's artwork covered the refrigerator, books were stacked on every surface, and the furniture showed the comfortable wear of people who actually used their living space. The kitchen smelled like garlic and herbs, and Emma moved around it with the easy confidence of someone cooking for people she cared about. Tyler helped set the table with the serious concentration of a 7-year-old who had been given an important job. He chattered constantly about his day at school, his excitement about an upcoming field trip, and his plans to build a fort in the backyard. Emma listened to every word, asking questions and offering suggestions with genuine interest. Watching them together, I realized what I had been missing in my own home. This was what family was supposed to look like. People who chose to spend time together, who were interested in each other's lives, who treated daily interactions as opportunities for connection rather than obligations to endure. During dinner, Tyler announced that he had written a story about a brave knight who helped sick children feel better. He insisted on reading it aloud, stumbling over some of the bigger words, but pressing on with determination. When he finished, Emma applauded with sincere enthusiasm, and Tyler beamed with pride. "Mr. Chen, do you want to hear another one? I wrote it yesterday about a dragon who was actually nice, but everyone thought he was mean." I found myself leaning forward, genuinely curious about this 7-year-old's creative world. "I would love to hear it, Tyler." As he ran to get his notebook, Emma smiled at me across the table. "He's been writing more since you started reading to the kids at the hospital. You've inspired him." The simple statement hit me with unexpected emotion. When was the last time someone had told me I had inspired them? When was the last time my presence had encouraged, rather than discouraged, someone else? I couldn't remember Rebecca or Sophie ever suggesting that I had positively influenced their lives in any way. After dinner, Tyler convinced me to help him with a puzzle while Emma cleaned up. He worked with intense focus, occasionally asking for help, but mostly determined to figure things out himself. When he successfully placed a difficult piece, he would look up at me with such genuine joy that I felt my chest tighten with an emotion I couldn't quite name. "Mr. Chen, when I grow up, I want to help sick kids like you do," Tyler said while searching for a corner piece. Emma says that's called being kind, and kind people make the world better. I glanced over at Emma, who was drying dishes and pretending not to listen to our conversation. I caught my eye and smiled, the kind of smile that acknowledged shared understanding without needing words. As the evening progressed, I found myself relaxing in ways I hadn't in years. The conversation flowed naturally, touching on everything from Tyler's school projects to Emma's work challenges to my own thoughts about books and travel and dreams I had forgotten I once had. Nobody checked their phone constantly. Nobody seemed eager for the evening to end, and nobody treated my contributions to the conversation as interruptions. When it was time to leave, Tyler hugged me goodbye with the unselfconscious affection of a child who hadn't yet learned to ration his feelings. Emma walked me to the door, and for a moment we stood in the soft porch light, neither of us quite ready to end the evening. David, I hope this isn't presumptuous, but Tyler and I were planning to go to the Christmas tree farm this weekend. Would you like to come with us? I mean, if you're feeling up to it. The invitation was offered gently, with consideration for my supposed health limitations, but also with genuine hope that I would say yes. It had been years since anyone had invited me to participate in their life, rather than simply expecting me to provide resources or support for their activities. I would like that very much, I heard myself saying, and realized I meant it completely. Driving home that night, I felt a strange sensation that it took me several minutes to identify happiness, not the grim satisfaction of a successful business deal or the relief of completing an obligation, but actual contentment with how I had spent my time in anticipation for future moments with these people who seemed to genuinely enjoy my company. When I walked into my house, the contrast was jarring. Becca was in her office on a video call with colleagues in Tokyo, speaking in the sharp professional tone she used for business. Sophie was in her room with music playing loudly, and the kitchen showed no evidence that anyone had thought about dinner for themselves, let alone saved any for me. I climbed the stairs to the master bedroom, where Rebecca's clothes from the day were scattered across the chair I usually used for reading. Her laptop was open on my side of the bed, surrounded by papers from work. Even in our shared space, there was no consideration for my presence or comfort. As I prepared for bed, I caught sight of myself in the bathroom mirror. The weight loss and careful styling I had maintained to support my cancer story had actually made me look healthier and more vital than I had in years. The stress lines around my eyes had softened, and there was something different in my expression that I gradually recognized as hope. I was still looking at my reflection when I heard Rebecca end her call and come into the bedroom. She glanced at me briefly and asked in a distracted voice, "How was treatment today?" "Fine," I replied, as I had dozens of times before. But this time, I found myself adding, "I spent some time with friends afterward. It helped." Rebecca paused in her bedtime routine, frowning slightly. "Friends? What friends?" I thought the support group was confidential. I realized I had never mentioned Emma and Tyler to her, had never described the volunteer work beyond the basic facts. My wife of 16 years had never once asked for details about how I was spending my time during this supposedly traumatic period of our lives. "Just people I've met," I said carefully. "People who understand what it's like to face difficult situations." She nodded absently and returned to her skincare routine, the conversation already forgotten. But I continued to watch my reflection, thinking about Tyler's easy laughter and Emma's attentive questions, and the way they had made me feel like someone worth knowing. For the first time since beginning this elaborate deception, I started to wonder what would happen when I eventually had to choose between the life I was pretending to leave and the life I was just beginning to discover. The crisis that would force my hand came 18 months into my deception on a snowy February evening when everything I had carefully constructed began to collapse simultaneously. I was supposed to be in my final weeks according to the timeline I had established, and the weight of maintaining the charade while living this double life had begun taking a toll I hadn't anticipated. Earlier that day, I had received devastating news that wasn't fake. Dr. Patricia Wong, Emma's closest colleague and friend at Oregon Medical Center, had been diagnosed with an aggressive brain tumor. The irony was crushing while I was pretending to die from cancer, a genuinely wonderful person who dedicated her life to healing children, was facing the real thing. Emma was inconsolable, and Tyler couldn't understand why his favorite doctor wouldn't be coming back to read stories with us anymore. I had spent the afternoon at the hospital, helping Emma navigate the shock while trying to comfort Tyler, who kept asking if Dr. Wang was going to get better like the children in the stories we read. The genuine grief and fear I witnessed made my own deception feel monstrous. There were people confronting real loss, real mortality, real suffering. While I played games with the same concepts for my own psychological experiment, when I finally returned home that evening, exhausted from the emotional weight of the day, I walked into what can only be described as a celebration. Rebecca had invited Marcus Rivera, her business consultant, who had been spending increasing amounts of time at our house, along with several friends and colleagues. The living room was filled with people drinking wine and laughing, the kind of gathering Rebecca usually organized when she wanted to impress important contacts. The moment I walked through the door, the room fell silent. Everyone turned to stare at me with expressions ranging from surprise to discomfort to barely concealed annoyance. It was clear that my presence was not expected or welcome at this gathering in my own home. Rebecca approached me with forced brightness, her cheeks flushed from wine and embarrassment. "David, darling, you're home early. How was your appointment today?" Before I could answer, Marcus stepped forward with the kind of confident smile that suggested he felt very comfortable in my house. "David, we were just discussing some exciting opportunities for the company's expansion into international markets. Rebecca has such innovative ideas." The way he said Rebecca's name, with a slight emphasis and familiarity, confirmed what I had been suspecting for weeks. The way he positioned himself slightly between her and me, the casual hand he placed on her shoulder, the intimate way they had been standing when I walked in. I wasn't just the dying husband being tolerated until nature took its course. I was the inconvenient obstacle being worked around while they planned their future together. Sophie appeared from the kitchen carrying a tray of appetizers, dressed up in a way that suggested this gathering had been planned well in advance. When she saw me, her face fell with the kind of disappointment reserved for adults who interrupt teenage parties. "Dad, I thought you were going to be at the hospital until late tonight," she said, her tone carrying a clear message that I was disrupting their evening. "I was helping a friend deal with some difficult news," I replied, watching the faces around the room carefully. Not one person asked what kind of difficult news, or whether there was anything they could do to help. They all just waited for me to excuse myself so they could continue their party. Marcus, clearly comfortable in his role as Rebecca's future partner, gestured toward the hallway. "Maybe you should get some rest, David. You look tired, and we know how important it is for you to conserve your strength." The condescending kindness in his voice, the way he spoke to me like a child who needed to be managed, triggered something I had been suppressing for months. I looked around the room at these people who were essentially attending my wake, while I was still alive, celebrating my approaching absence, while pretending to care about my well-being. "Actually, Marcus, I'm feeling quite energetic tonight," I said, moving further into the living room instead of retreating. "This is wonderful." "Rebecca, I had no idea you were planning a gathering. What's the occasion?" The silence that followed was deafening. Rebecca's eyes darted between Marcus and the other guests, clearly scrambling for an explanation that wouldn't expose the true nature of their celebration. "It's just a small business meeting that turned into dinner," she said finally. "Nothing formal. We were discussing some projects that will be implemented after, when the company transitions to new leadership." "After I die?" she meant. "When Marcus takes over my role in both the company and her life?" They were literally planning my replacement while I stood there pretending to waste away from cancer. "How thoughtful of you to plan ahead," I said with a smile that made several people shift uncomfortably. "I'm sure the transition will be seamless." Marcus seems very prepared to step into new responsibilities. The double meaning wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Marcus's jaw tightened, and Rebecca's face flushed deeper. Sophie looked between the adults with the dawning realization that something significant was happening, though she couldn't quite grasp what. "Dad, maybe you should take your medication and rest," Sophie suggested, clearly wanting to end whatever tension she was sensing. "You seem kind of weird tonight." "I feel more clear-headed than I have in months," I replied, settling into my favorite armchair with no intention of leaving. Please, don't let me interrupt. I'd love to hear about these future plans. What followed was the most awkward hour of my life. The guests made stilted conversation while clearly wanting to leave. Marcus attempted to maintain his confident demeanor while obviously uncomfortable with my presence. Rebecca tried to play the devoted wife while shooting meaningful glances at her future lover, and Sophie grew increasingly agitated that her sophisticated evening was being ruined by her inconveniently present father. The breaking point came when Rebecca's phone rang, and she stepped onto the back patio to take the call. Through the sliding glass door, I could see her pacing and gesturing in obvious distress. When she returned, her face was pale and her hands were shaking. "David, we need to talk privately," she said in a voice that cut through all the pretense of the evening. The guests took this as their cue to leave, gathering coats and purses with unseemly haste. Marcus lingered, clearly reluctant to abandon Rebecca to whatever crisis had developed, but she waved him away with promises to call him later. Sophie disappeared upstairs with the dramatic sighs of a teenager whose social plans had been destroyed. When we were finally alone, Rebecca poured herself another glass of wine with hands that weren't quite steady. That was Dr. Harrison's office, she said, referring to the oncologist I was supposedly seeing for treatment. "They called to schedule your next appointment, but when I mentioned your name, they said they have no record of you as a patient." My carefully constructed world tilted on its axis. On all my planning, I had never considered that Rebecca might try to contact my fictional medical team directly. It assumed her general disinterest in the details of my condition would protect me from this kind of scrutiny. "There must be some mistake," I said automatically, my mind racing through possible explanations. "Maybe they have it under a different name, or there's been a mix-up with the insurance." Rebecca set down her wine glass and looked at me with an expression I had never seen before, sharp, calculating, and completely without warmth. "David, I've been suspicious for weeks. You don't look like someone who's dying. You look healthier than you have in years. You disappear for hours at a time, for treatments that don't seem to affect you the way they should." And tonight, when I needed to reach Dr. Harrison's office to discuss hospice arrangements, I discovered that you've been lying to us for over a year. The word hospice hit me like a physical blow. While I had been discovering what genuine human connection felt like with Emma and Tyler, my wife had been planning my final care arrangements with the eager efficiency of someone making vacation reservations. "Hospice," I repeated, my voice sounding strange even to myself. Rebecca's mask slipped completely. "Yes, hospice. Because according to your timeline, you should be dying any day now, and I need to make arrangements. Do you have any idea how embarrassing it was to call about end-of-life care for a patient who doesn't exist?" She wasn't angry about being deceived or worried about my actual health, or confused about why I had felt the need to create such an elaborate lie. She was embarrassed about the social awkwardness of the situation. "The question now," she continued, her voice taking on the cold, businesslike tone she used for difficult negotiations, "is what we're going to do about this. Because you've put me in an impossible position, David. I've told people you're dying. I've made plans based on your death. Marcus and I have been preparing for a future that apparently isn't going to happen on schedule." So there it was. The truth laid bare with brutal efficiency. My wife hadn't been grieving my approaching death. She had been impatiently waiting for it so she could start her new life with my business partner. My daughter hadn't been struggling with losing her father. She had been planning her inheritance, and I had given them 18 months to adjust to the idea of life without me, only to discover that they had adjusted far better than I had ever imagined. "What do you want from me, Rebecca?" I asked, genuinely curious about what she considered an acceptable resolution to this situation. Her answer revealed the final piece of who she really was. "I want you to disappear. David, I don't care how you do it or where you go, but you've made promises that you need to keep. We've moved on. We've made commitments based on your death. And frankly, your continued existence is going to complicate everything." She was asking me to complete my fake death by actually disappearing from their lives permanently. She wanted me to choose exile so she could have the benefits of widowhood without the inconvenience of divorce proceedings or shared custody arrangements. As I sat there processing her request, my phone buzzed with a text message from Emma. "Tyler keeps asking when you're coming for dinner again. He's worried because you seem sad today. Are you okay? The contrast between Rebecca's cold demand that I vanish and Emma's gentle concern for my well-being crystallized everything I had learned over the past 18 months. I had been living two completely different lives, and it was time to choose. Which one was real? I looked at Rebecca standing there in our expensive living room, surrounded by the remnants of her party with Marcus, waiting for my response to her demand that I simply vanish from existence. The woman I had spent 16 years trying to please was asking me to complete my elaborate deception by actually disappearing so she could collect the social and financial benefits of my death without the mesinsis of my continued breathing. You want me to just leave? I said. It's not really a question, but a confirmation of something I was finally understanding completely. It would be best for everyone, she replied with the calm certainty of someone who had thought this through thoroughly. Sophie is already emotionally prepared for losing you. She's made plans for college based on the life insurance money, made commitments to Marcus about our future together. Continuing to exist just creates problems for people who have moved on. The casual way she discussed my existence as a logistical problem was actually liberating. For the first time in our marriage, Rebecca was being completely honest about how she saw me, as an obstacle to be removed rather than a person to be loved. I pulled out my phone and showed her Emma's text message. Someone else has a different opinion about whether my existence creates problems. Rebecca glanced at the message with mild curiosity. Who's Emma? The fact that she didn't know Emma's name after 18 months of my supposed illness told me everything.
Oh.
I needed to know about how little interest she had taken in my actual daily experience. She had never asked who was supporting me through treatment, who I talked to about my fears, or how I was coping emotionally with facing death. Emma is someone who makes me dinner and remembers how I like my coffee, I said simply. She's someone whose 7-year-old nephew hugs me goodbye and asks when I'm coming back. She's someone who listens when I talk and notices when I'm having a difficult day. Rebecca's expression shifted to something between annoyance and recognition. You're having an affair? No, Rebecca. I'm having a friendship. I'm experiencing what it feels like when people actually want me around instead of waiting for me to leave. She processed this information with the same analytical approach she brought to business problems. Well, that's convenient then. Can go be with your new friends, and we can all move forward with our lives. Just like that? Just like that? You've been essentially gone for months anyway. This just makes it official. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the neighborhood where I had lived for 8 years but never really belonged. In the distance, I could see the lights of downtown Portland, where Emma and Tyler were probably finishing homework and getting ready for bed in their small house that somehow felt more like home than this mansion ever had. What about Sophie? I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. Rebecca shrugged with practiced indifference. Sophie adjusted to the idea of losing you over a year ago. Well, she'll be fine. It's better, actually, since there won't be any awkward explanations about miraculous recoveries. And you'll tell people what exactly? That you died peacefully at home, surrounded by family. Private cremation, no service per your wishes. Very simple, very clean. She had it all figured out. My death would be as tidy and convenient as my life had been inconvenient and complicated. No messy grief, no difficult questions, just a smooth transition to the life she actually wanted. I turned back to face her. This woman who had shared my bed and name for 16 years but had never actually seen me as a person worth keeping around. You realize what you're asking me to do, right? You're asking me to let you tell the world. I'm dead so you can start over without the inconvenience of divorce proceedings. I'm asking you to finish what you started, she corrected. You began this deception, David. I'm just suggesting you complete it in a way that works for everyone. The strange thing was, she was right. I had started this elaborate performance to discover who would actually miss me if I were gone. The answer was clear. Rebecca and Sophie wouldn't miss me at all. They had already practiced living without me and found the experience so pleasant they wanted to make it permanent. But Emma and Tyler would miss me. They had spent 18 months getting to know the real David Chen, not the performance version I had been playing for my family. They had chosen to include me in their lives not because they needed something from me, but because they genuinely enjoyed my company. Okay, I said finally, and Rebecca visibly relaxed. Okay, I'll disappear. But I have conditions. Her relief was immediately replaced by wariness. What conditions? First, you handle all the legal paperwork to declare me dead. I don't want any loose ends that might complicate things later. Second, you never contact me again, and you make sure Sophie understands that her father is gone permanently. Third, you explain to people that I wanted to die privately, which is why there's no funeral or memorial service. Rebecca nodded eagerly. That's very reasonable. I can handle all of that. And fourth, I continued, you transfer half of our joint savings to an account I specify before you file any paperwork. Consider it the cost of avoiding a messy divorce. She hesitated at this, her business instincts kicking in, but then nodded. Fine. Half the savings. That's it. 3 weeks later, David Chen officially died of pancreatic cancer in his home in Portland, Oregon. His widow, Rebecca Martinez Chen, inherited his life insurance policy and married business consultant Marcus Rivera in a small ceremony 6 months later. Their daughter Sophie Chen went to Stanford University on a full scholarship funded by her father's death benefits. And in a small house in the Hawthorne district, Emma Thompson introduced her new boyfriend David Thompson to her coworkers. At Oregon Medical Center, where he had started volunteering full-time with pediatric patients, Tyler Thompson, age 8, proudly told his classmates that his new dad was the best storyteller in the whole world and made the most amazing homemade candy. I never did find out what happened at my funeral because I didn't have one, but I did attend Tyler's school play, Emma's birthday dinner, and hundreds of ordinary evenings that felt more like living than anything I had experienced in my previous life. Sometimes the best way to discover who you really are is to let everyone else believe you're dead. It turns out that dying to the people who never truly saw you alive is the most liberating thing you can do. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. This one hit the mark. You won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.